You up on the forthcoming Iraqi crisis and try to relate it to the domestic situation. It seems to me that there is a consensus in favor of military action. I tend to discount the Columbus business, at least among the Congress and the administration. If it is true that there has been real noncompliance and a real attempt to thwart the latest inspection efforts, it seems to me that there's already a consensus, and indeed there was criticism of the president for giving Saddam one last chance, and therefore I don't see that he would be accused of cynicism except by carpers, marginal carpers, and I don't put you in that category because there really is a consensus, and if there are violations, it would seem to me that it would be an opportunity for the nation to come together rather than to have carping on both sides about political opportunism.
Well, I mean, let's have no carping, but if there was to be carping, I say again, it would derive such force as it had from previous policy mistakes, things both done and undone. It would be nice to think there was a consensus on it, but as I say, that involves, it seems to me, deciding what the objective for Iraq is going to be, because you can't just manage it. Does anybody think that if there was a strike now, say to blind Saddam's communications, and sorry, I swore I wouldn't call him Saddam, to blind the Hussein regime's communications and to take out perhaps some of the presidential sites, and that would be the end of it, that he'd say, well, now I see, the error of my ways, we can start again. It wouldn't. It would be another in this long period of torturing the Iraqi people by means of pinpricking their government and starving them. I think this is a degrading way to be doing business. An announcement should be made of what they think the outcome in Iraq should be. Now, there has been an open statement that support's going to be given to the Iraqi democratic opposition and to the Kurds, and I think that's good, because the covert support to those people before led to them being betrayed, and also led to them being misrepresented as agents of a foreign power. I think it should be above board. If we can say that much above board, why not the rest of it? Why not the whole program?
Well, my sense was that the bombing may well not be pinpricks this time, but if they're talking about at least 10,000 casualties, that it could be moving in the direction of regime threatening, which is something of an objective, or at least a punishment.
As far as we know, it's an objective, but they won't say the objective is to, that would be the objective. This seems to me really, really potentially very irresponsible indeed. I mean, that's 10,000 is a lot. And we certainly don't have the right to use Iraq as a laboratory experiment or its people as laboratory animals. And as long as this is dragged on, it seems to me that's how it must feel to them and how it's beginning to look to outsiders. I think it would be much more just and more courageous to say, we consider the Hussein regime to be a common enemy of humanity, of its own people and of its neighbors. It can no longer be said that we'd be intervening in their internal affairs by saying this. I mean, their internal affairs have been very well interfered with. That boundary has been crossed, that fire break's been crossed. We're going to go in and remove the regime.
Hasn't Albright said that?
No. She said she wishes, that he'd go, but not that and replacing the regime would really mean entering Iraq and toppling it, and then encouraging the opposition forces to come out and hold an election form of provisional government. But that would mean staying on for some time. That's a commitment I don't think the president would dream of selling or trying to sell to the American people at this or any other time. He hopes, in my judgment, to pass it on to the next president, who may be upon us sooner than we think. But I think that was always what he wanted to do with Iraq. But it's no more grave and no more destructive an intervention than starving the Iraqis and dueling over their heads with the Ba'athist leadership.
You're saying that the ultimate requirement for this strategy to work is U.S. ground forces and several 100,000.
Well, or so to speak, an international brigade, to go into Iraq. And yes,
more than a brigade, though.
Yes,
talking about several hundred thousand
using it as a metaphor for internationalism, as in, say, the attempted defense of the Spanish Republic, say, to Arab neighbors and others, look, it's got to come to the point we have to settle this. We have to move him out, but we have to move him out in such a way as we're simultaneously moving other people in. You could get him out by destroying the whole of Baghdad, of course. That would be unconscionable.
Well,
Polite and condensed introduction. So I'll close on this observation and then we'll begin to exchange. On this point of the legality of assuming the right to change the government of another state, I think there are 4 points that absolutely must be borne in mind. A state is deemed to have lost its sovereignty and to have become subject to intervention and regime change on one of 4 conditions: that it has violated the Genocide Convention, of which we are signatory. Genocide Convention mandates that in the case of the advice of an attempt to destroy in whole or in part a national or ethnic group, that action be taken either to prevent or, if that's not possible, to punish that action. That's an obligation. International law further states that a state has lost its sovereignty if it gives aid and comfort and harbours, aid and comfort to, I should say, and harbours forces of international gangsterism, non-state actors who engage in indiscriminate violence against civilians, in other words, if it commits repeated aggressions against neighbouring states or occupations of their territory, and of course, if it violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty or is in other ways discovered to be fooling around with weapons of mass destruction. Iraq has violated all 4 of these very important precepts, or under the leadership of Saddam had violated them several times. Another confrontation with the Saddam Hussein regime was inevitable. I've never heard a single argument from anybody who says that that contingency was an avoidable one. Another round with that regime, imploding even as it was, and becoming more dangerous as it imploded, was a sure thing. The question you have to face, and face as if you had to take the decision yourselves, not as spectators, not as consumers, not as mere onlookers, as if you had to take it yourself. The decision you have to make is this: who should determine the timing of that next inevitable confrontation? Should it again be left to Saddam Hussein, as it was when he decided to use the weapons of genocide on the people of Kurdistan, as it was when he invaded Iran, as it was when he abolished the existence of Kuwait? Or was it time, and long past time, for democratic nations and for democratic forces within them to insist, no, that we will decide the timing this time, and we will move Iraq into the post-Saddam era, and we will free its people from their appalling imprisonment, and we will certify their state as disarmed, which could not be certified other than by regime change, and we will prevent it from being used as a launching pad and training ground for gangsters from Abu Nidal on down. As I say, I think that decision was taken long overdue and in some ways incompetently, but I'm extremely proud to have associated myself with that side of the argument, and I'm going to maintain that till the last dog dies tonight. Thanks for coming. Iraq is not occupied. It's okay, no, believe me, I've seen a whole lot worse. And heard. Iraq is not occupied by President Jalal Talabani. Okay? President Jalal Talabani is not in occupation of his own country. He's the first elected president Iraq has ever had. I think it's fair, furthermore, to say that without the presence of American and British soldiers there, there would not have been that election. But is this occupation, as you understand? President Talabani's people 10 years ago were living in poisoned and ruined and gassed towns, a despised, mass-murdered minority driven onto the hillsides out of their ruined cities. I think it's rather marvellous that a man of that calibre and bravery, the leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the corresponding party, by the way, in Iraq of the Socialist International, of which I'm myself a member, should be able to run for election and win with the votes of Iraqis and Kurds of all stripes. That's not, it's an insult to say he's occupying his own country. He's the first leader the Iraqis have ever had the chance to choose themselves. And if it took soldiers to do it, then we should be very proud of it. And anyone who says... And I'll make a pact with anyone on this, any questioner in the future, or Mr. Rittenau or our chair, I will not speak for the dead, or presume to do so, if they won't. But I don't like hearing the dead spoken for, and I suspect of grave demagogy and bad faith anyone who makes the assumption that they can invoke the names of our dead in their own cause. I promise I won't do it. And if I did, you'd see how ludicrous and parodic it would look. So don't do it yourself, if you take my moral advice.
But
it's obscene to do it, and it shouldn't be done.
But Christopher, the president has done it.
I know.
The president has justified the continuing of the war based on the people.
There are two things I believe that should never be said. One is, if you support a war, that it must go on by definition, because otherwise those who've already died have died in vain. There's no war that couldn't be justified by a rhetorical sleight of hand like that. That's sheer demagogy too. It commits the same obscenity. I've written this many times. Well, but if that's wrong, then it's wrong also to say that because of our dead, a war is not worth fighting. The moral question of deciding, ladies and gentlemen, for yourselves and debating with others whether or not a war is just is one of the oldest questions before humanity. It's a very important matter, quite complex and quite intense. It cannot be discussed by those who say that only a war is just if it leads to no death. That's morally frivolous. It's morally null. It's ahistorical. It's silly. You should give it up. You look like fools when you try.
Mr. Wall, due respect.